o'clock on Radio 4. Good morning from John Timpson, Libby Purvis and all the Today team.
And it looks as if Britain may have its first woman Prime Minister.
If you were tuning in to Radio 4 in the east of England in the 1970s, you might not have heard the Today programme. Instead, you may well have been listening to this, the theme tune that opened BBC East's very own breakfast show. Long before local radio came to the region, the BBC was broadcasting its own programmes from the heart of East Anglia. Today, these shows have been almost forgotten, but this is their story.
The people of Brandon in Suffolk have voted in favour of cruise missiles being sighted in the area.
And it's all over your scripts and everything else. I hope you can read all that.
The accent of the new generation of East Anglians.
Thank you very much, John. Read like a row of tents.
The Chopin Impromptu No. 2, the Monday morning choice of the Bishop of Ellis.
He's talking about the great Local Government Reform Act of 1835, but I mean, it's not as dry as it sounds.
The BBC launched its first local radio stations in 1967, and by the early 70s 20 stations had been opened across the country. None of them were in the east of England, however, and there was a break in starting new services while the government decided how radio should be allowed to expand. But that didn't mean that there was no BBC presence in the east. The corporation had arrived in Norwich in 1955, opening up a regional headquarters in a Georgian house at All Saints Green in the city. From here they broadcast television news for the East, as well as regional radio bulletins on the BBC Home Service. It was in 1969 that producer Michael Chapman arrived at All Saints Green to work not just on radio bulletins, but on full programmes for the eastern counties.
There were two really East Anglian programmes, Happy Weekend Everybody, Saturday morning opt-out, and also on a Saturday, a very short Sports Extra programme in the evening, which consisted of football results, cricket results, that kind of thing. It couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 minutes. But we were contributing to the wider Midlands and East Anglia home service. So, for instance, one of my first jobs was to produce Ted Ellis for a regular programme for the wider home service. We also produced a programme in Norwich with Rennie Cutforth, the veteran war correspondent, called Personal Column. That was also one of my production jobs. And we produced regional editions, probably on a monthly or quarterly basis, for a programme called Home This Afternoon. And also David Richardson, a local farmer, did some editions of Farming Today for the Home Service. So that was the genuinely local output.
When Michael joined the BBC in Norwich, one of the presenters who was already working there was former Radio Caroline DJ Tom Edwards. After the government had outlawed offshore radio in August 1967, Tom had joined the BBC as a presenter on the TV news programme Look East.
I left Radio Caroline just a mere 12 hours before the Marine Offences Bill became law. And then within a matter of a few weeks, I found myself doing Look East at the old BBC studios in Norwich at All Saints Green. I can remember that the local bulletins were being read for East Anglia on Radio 4 as a VHF opt-out, but not many people had VHF sets in those days, so perhaps it restricted the audience in a way. And because I just left pirate radio, obviously I was very interested in radio, and because it was like one big happy family at the BBC in Norwich, I used to converse with a marvellous radio producer called Tom Wisdom, and lo and behold, out of the blue, with no warning whatsoever, Tom and the boss man there, Johnny Johnson, asked me if I'd like to introduce Happy Weekend Everybody. That title sounds a bit twee now, but I have happy memories of that programme. It was a mixture of everything, I suppose. It was a light-hearted magazine programme that I seem to remember went out on a Saturday morning, round about 8:10 in the morning till about 8:45 in the morning. And we'd have a complete run-through at 7:05 in the morning. What gave it more clout, I suppose, is we were the first regional magazine programme to go on Radio 4 VHF for East Anglia with a mixture of music. And we got into trouble with the music we played because the Radio 4 audience suddenly heard this ex-pirate radio disc jockey playing everything from Semprini to rock and roll and Bill Haley and the Comets, and lots of complaints were heading to the letters department of the Eastern Daily Press and the Eastern Evening News. There was uproar for these devotees of Radio 4.
The programmes broadcast from Norwich were so-called opt-outs from the main network. So National Radio 4 continued on medium or long wave, while the regional programmes were broadcast on VHF, or FM as we'd now call it. However, as Michael Chapman remembers, those early opt-outs didn't always run entirely to plan.
At the time I joined, the only genuine morning news magazine was a programme called Regional Extra, which was produced in Birmingham, pre-recorded the night before. And it was infamous for the fact that because it was pre-recorded, often they would play the wrong tape. So you'd be sitting at breakfast thinking, I think I've heard these stories before. And of course you had, because they'd put yesterday's tape on rather than today's tape. So we'd got a fairly low starting point in quality of local output.
There are happier memories of the broadcasting environment itself.
The radio studios were superb in this beautiful Georgian house. And we actually sat in, I suppose, what must have been the front living room or the lounge of this gorgeous mansion. Everything was soundproof. The sound quality in that studio was superb. And also the studio was used for network programs. I can remember doing a night ride live from Norwich, from that very studio that we did Happy Weekend Everybody, right to the entire network of radios 1 and 2 in those days, from midnight till 2 in the morning. And it was a great joy to me to present not only regional programs but also national programs from my home city of Norwich.
The studio and the control room were converted out of two rooms. Absolutely superb. The studio, bay window looking out onto the lawn behind, absolutely fabulous. Our office was the old narrator's studio, which also looked out onto green lawn. The control room was the television control room, and into that we put a couple of tape machines and a mixing desk and some gram decks.
It was in April 1970 that a new daily news programme for the Eastern Counties was launched from the Norwich studio. This was a half-hour opt-out from the Today programme called This is East Anglia. 2 editions of this survive in the Norfolk Sound Archive, thanks to the estate of Jean Goodman, who sometimes presented the show.
Radio 4, VHF for East Anglia. And now from Norwich, this is East Anglia, introduced by Jean Goodman.
Good morning. In today's programme, a conference of marine scientists who've been studying what goes into our seas. Then, after the weather forecast, an in-depth study on the unhappy subject.
You need to set this in context of the idea of the development of local radio as a result of the broadcasting in the 70s report. It was decided in that report that the Midlands and East Anglia was such a huge region that it needed to be broken up. So therefore East Anglia was given a little bit more independence. Part of that independence was a stab at a morning regional magazine programme to cement the BBC's identity within the region. The notion was that this programme wouldn't last very long because local radio would be on its way quite quickly to East Anglia. And that sort of sets the context for Roundabout East Anglia, because after a while it became very clear with the almost constant, almost ever-present BBC budget reductions that local radio was not going to come to East Anglia in the 70s, and therefore we were given a more substantial stopgap to make an even better regional presence once they realised that local radio was an even longer way off than they'd originally believed.
The new 2-hour programme, Roundabout East Anglia, was first broadcast on the 5th of August 1974. However, Tom Edwards had moved on, and behind the microphone for the first year of Roundabout East Anglia's run was former Blue Peter presenter Christopher Trace. The show's last presenter for its final 18 months was ex-BBC World Service announcer John Mountford. In between Trace and Mountford came Roundabout's longest-serving presenter, Ellis Hill.
I, at that time, was working down at Anglia Television. I was doing a women's programme called About Women, but that came to an end. But at the same time, lucky for me, BBC REA, Roundabout East Anglia, was advertising for a new presenter. And so I got in touch, and I was lucky that I got it.
being offered the possibility of Christopher Trace, having watched him on Blue Peter, was a kind of mixture of hero worship, boyhood dream come true. Here's a guy I've watched on television, and feeling sort of slightly sad about the end of a career with Ellis, who'd got experience with Anglia Television with John Mountford. I think it was interviewing to find presenters who had the skills that we required, that could work with relatively hard news, but were quite happy with the magazine format. And it got a nice and easy style, which, I mean, and all three of the presenters had that nice easy style.
For Ellis Hill, one studio guest on the programme proved to be particularly memorable.
We had what I call the porridge man. This porridge man had just won an award in Norfolk for the amount of porridge that he could eat. Great, we thought, we'll have him in. So, OK, while I'm interviewing him and chatting on to him, we'd got the canteen to supply him with many bowls of porridge. And he ate them, bowl after bowl after bowl. I was amazed. But bless him, he'd won the award. That was his, I don't know, claim to fame. And good luck to him. I must admit, by the time all of us, our group, when we'd finished the programme at 9:15, we'd all go down to the canteen for breakfast. Neither I or anybody else could eat any breakfast after watching him eating all these bowls of porridge. But good luck to him.
I bet she hasn't told you the story when she gave me a mother and a father of a dressing down for not ringing her the night before to say that there would be a live interview in the studio, saying that how could I possibly do this to her, putting a live guest into the studio when she brought no makeup in with her because it was radio and breakfast time and they weren't expecting a guest. She wasn't looking at her best. I learned my lesson after that. Even if it was 1 o'clock in the morning, it would be phone call. You know, you've got a live guest in the morning. Make sure you look and feel presentable.
On your birthday. From Daddy, Mummy, Sister Rachel, Nanny and Granddaddy Elaine, Auntie Chris, Auntie Marion and their families. And to Louise Hitch of Cromarty Road, Stamford, 4 today. Hello, Louise. Lots of love to you, darling. Best belated birthday wishes from Lillian and Caroline. Then I've got Janet and David and Matthew and Thomas.
We never had any audience figures that I was aware of, because I suspect the numbers were quite small within the audience research surveys. I think the show was known of. I think it was appreciated. I suspect it was more appreciated in Cambridgeshire, the sort of Northamptonshire bit around Peterborough, Huntingdonshire, Suffolk, North Essex, where they really hadn't been getting a look in as far as local stroke regional broadcasting was concerned. You always got the feeling that it was a quite a loyal audience, quite a keen audience, but I suspect in pure numbers it was quite a small audience. Don't forget that VHF FM radios were just beginning to be within the reach of say normal people, ordinary people. They were just becoming cheaper. I mean, one of the first things I was bought as an official BBC token of my managerial status within the BBC was an FM radio, was a Grundig FM radio, which the BBC allowed me to keep, and I still have. That radio probably cost nearly £200 in 1974, 75. So it was a lot of money.
Two people who had not initially heard of the programme were Phil Johnson and Maggie Secker, who became junior members of the behind-the-scenes team in the late 1970s.
Do you know, I was not aware of Roundabout East Anglia until I actually walked in the building to start work on it. Terrible thing, because if you were interviewed for a job today and they never heard of the station, they wouldn't have hope, and quite rightly so. But, you know, I was a young firebrand sort of student type who listened to you know, sort of Radio 1 and various other things. And the idea of listening to a Radio 4 VHF programme. Also, I hadn't lived in Norwich, so I'd lived in Leicester as a student, and I wasn't aware of it. Of course, I was very aware of Look East, and I used to watch Look East regularly when I was at home.
I have to be honest, it was on Radio 4, it was between 6 and 8 in the morning. I was 34, 35 years old, and I was just interested in what were the pop hits of the day. So for me, I just wanted music all day long. And yes, I was interested in the news to a point, but not so much so that I listened to Radio 4 for it. I'd got a young daughter, she was about 3 years old, and I thought I'd like to do some work. I wanted to stay at home during the day and saw a job advertised in the paper for evening work with the BBC. And I thought, that sounds pretty cool, working for the BBC. I won't get the job, but by George, to go for an interview would be really, really fun. I did actually get an interview, got all dressed up and went for this and thought it would be fun to go into that wonderful building on All Saints Green. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. And I sat in there and I thought what I can do is just watch all the people coming down that I've seen on the telly. But actually I went in for the interview and I did get a telephone call later offering me this post on Roundabout East Anglia, working in the evenings. It was a secretary as a typist, typing scripts and running orders for the presenter. Not something that's done nowadays, of course, in local radio.
Phil Johnson remembers how the style of presentation for Roundabout evolved during its run.
There was the embryonic sort of way of other local radios in there, the way it developed. And especially with what John Mountford brought to it, because he was very much the sort of more modern radio presenter. Because Ellis Hill, Gene Goodman, fantastic broadcasters, very much from the Radio 4 stable, very much, sort of the traditional Radio 4 stable. And, the sort of thing you'll hear today on You and Yours and Woman's Hour, very, very much the same. Fantastic, absolute great quality. John had that kind of slight, lighter, brighter, more bouncy edge, which became local radio.
But back to this morning, where the time is 6:30, and you tune to Radio 4 VHF for the Eastern Counties. Good morning. Welcome to Roundabout East Anglia.
I was working for the BBC in London, who trained me over the course of a number of years in various things like studio management, script writing, whatever. I was one of the lucky ones in the days when the BBC used to train its own staff. And I was very, very happy working with BBC World Service and also at Broadcasting House for a while. But after 6 years in London, I began to get rather tired of it and look around and think, what am I going to do with my life? And by chance, I saw a little slip of paper on a notice board in Bush House saying, presenter wanted, Norwich. And my first thought was, where's Norwich? But nevertheless, got on a train, got myself up here and did an audition for Michael Chapman. And I left my wife wandering around Norwich shopping. We'd already decided what a beautiful place it was. And Michael Chapman offered me the job virtually on the spot. It was wonderful because I would come in the morning and there would already be a team there, or usually a couple of people in the building already set up and ready to go. Overnight, tapes had been collected, cues, sheets of paper, lead-ins that we could read to the tapes had already been written. So I came to a pre-built programme. There wasn't so much of the panic that you get about doing things live on air, because it was already it was put to bed in the early hours of the morning. So I got the joy of coming in, being briefed for about a quarter of an hour on what we expected to come up in the programme. I'd already selected my records the day before, and they'd be stacked there, and I had the opportunity to actually just check them all through, make sure everything was in place, settle down, and then I would run the SIG tune at the start. That was one of the things I do remember. I did have it on cassette, on cartridge, tape cartridge, and I actually would run the theme tune, and away we went.
Phil Johnson again.
The physical thing of putting Roundabout East Anglia on the air, because that's what I did every morning, you had to go with a special key to unlock the device. It was a bit like launching a nuclear missile, a special key, and there was a big silver lever that you used to bring down that would actually give you control and send the signal from your studio to the transmitters. And then you were actually in control. But it was like you felt like you were carrying the crown jewels.
At the end of the programme, I would come off air. Usually we'd all go down to the canteen, have a really lovely breakfast. And then I would usually head off to the Graham's Library and select the music for the next day. Then settle down at a typewriter and type replies to the many letters that we got in of all sorts of queries and programme ideas and all the rest of it. Somewhere along the line we would have a programme meeting about any long-term projects we'd got on, and then it was lunchtime, down to the canteen for lunch, and probably, if I was lucky, I could get away home then, having started the day at 5 o'clock, getting out of bed at 5.
It was very much like a sort of cross between the Radio 4 Today programme and local radio breakfast shows of today in many ways. Yes, the programme would start off, there'd be a sort of a menu, there'd be a bit of music. There were recorded items on tape from the night before. There were a few live guests, but not that many from memory.
It's 24 minutes past 8 o'clock and time for a look at the weather in store for us today from the Honington Weather Centre and Bruce Framp.
Good morning again from Honington. Well, it's rain before 7, fine before 11, more or less.
Sport time now, and with the sport this morning, John Mills.
And we start with football, and while European champions Nottingham Forest were enjoying their civic reception in front of thousands of fans last night...
Now for news for travellers, and at our AA studio, here's Roy Waller.
Hello again, Jill. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the roads are very wet in the region today, so please be careful, as the roads could be very slippery on the top surface. Also, leave enough space between you and the vehicle in front, and watch your speed. It's better to arrive late than not at all.
First, that loophole in the Local Government Act which provided the first electoral test of whether cruise missiles should be based in Britain. And the test was carried out in the unlikely setting of the small Suffolk town of Brandon. Radio, television and the national press gathered in the community centre for the momentous occasion. And our reporter was Carol West.
The people of Brandon were much more amused about the publicity their referendum attracted.
Maggie Secker, one of the production secretaries on Roundabout East Anglia, recalls how the recorded features were sent in by the reporters.
I used to go in at 6 o'clock. My hours were 6 till 10, but obviously if the work wasn't done, you waited until you'd finished your job, because sometimes the tapes, there were editors there, producers who were editing tapes for the morning, because with it being regional, there were reporters in... Well, the ones that I knew of, there was Stuart, Jarrold in Ipswich, and Pat Beasley was in the Cambridge area, Peterborough, and they would go out and do stories in those areas. But of course, they had their big ewers, as we called them, the tape machines, with the 5-inch tapes on. When they'd finished, they would put their tapes in the boxes, and they would put them on the train. And part of my job was to order a taxi to go to Thorpe Station to pick up the tapes from either of those reporters, to bring it back to the back door, and I would go to the back door of the BBC building, collect these tapes and take them through to the editor-producers, who would then get them ready for the morning. But it was so exciting, you know, going through, I'd take the tape through, and these big editing machines, you know, I just thought, wow, I'd never seen anything like that before. Had no aspirations of working in radio because it meant moving to London, and I'm a Norfolk girl, aren't I? I've got to go up to London, boy.
The reporters were a very kind of tight-knit little body, really, and obviously they were paid by their items and they earned their money, and they didn't really want anybody else to muscle in on this. Now, there I was as a sort of staff person who suddenly came up with this idea to do an item, because I wanted to try my hand at reporting. That's where I wanted to go, and I suggested to the editor that I did a story about Remploy, who are an organisation that provide employment for people with disabilities. He said, great. I went out there with a tape recorder, did this item, edited it, and it went out on air. Well, the next day, one of the reporters, whose name will be nameless, came up and threatened to do something rather unpleasant, because he said, you know, you're taking our bread and butter away, and if they use oiks like you, they won't be using, you know, there I was, sort of 23 or whatever, you know, beard, moustache, fairly untidy hair, sociology graduate, you know, keen and eager to get going. They won't use us, old boy. And it was a bit kind of like that. But, you know, I suppose that's what eventually happened.
I'm Stuart, Jarrold. I was based in Ipswich, and I was the reporter that covered South Suffolk and the Essex area for Roundabout East Anglia. I used to do odd bits and pieces. I was a freelance journalist, and I was writing for local and national newspapers. I'd started off by doing football reports for a chap called Tom Wisdom, who used to produce a 5-minute regional opt-out from Birmingham. And I used to do football match reports on a Saturday. And after that, I started doing news broadcasts. And when Roundabout East Anglia started, I was asked if I'd like to have a contract and be a regular contributor.
You're listening to Radio in a Roundabout Way, the story of the BBC's programmes for the East of England in the days before local radio. Reporters on Roundabout East Anglia could find themselves covering all manner of stories. For example, Ipswich-based correspondent Stuart Jarrold interviewed one man who was convinced he could safely leap from an aeroplane without a parachute.
But how on earth are you going to jump out of an aeroplane at 2,000 feet without crashing to the ground and killing yourself?
because I know that the mind can control the body. I've proved it in other ways, on stage, in front of investigative journalists. I've proved that levitation can take place. Journalists have been on
We had what
stage.
were called Ewer tape recorders, reel-to-reel tape recorders, very heavy things with a nickel-cadmium chargeable battery. And the difficulty was, in those days, you would record the interview, and as often as not, you would have to sit in the car outside the railway station at Ipswich, and I did this hundreds and hundreds of times, editing the tape, because often people were stumbling or were nervous, and there were a lot of ums and ahs, and you had to edit those out. And you had to edit a package often with sound effects, and put a nice little package together for the producers to save them work. And very often I would sit, and very often in the dark and in the cold, editing a package and putting it on a train to Norwich. Then it was picked up off the train at Norwich and brought into the studio, and sometimes they would edit it even more if they were tight for time. But as freelancers, of course, we were always paid by the minute. So we used to edit them long in the hope that they would run a long story of 4 minutes plus, because if it was sort of 3 minutes or less, I think we got less money.
Phil Johnson.
The way they used to get paid, and I'm sure they won't mind me telling you all these years on, is they got paid by the duration of the item. So if an item was over 3 minutes and 15 seconds long, they'd get a bigger payment than if it was under 3 minutes and 15 seconds long. So they would often edit this thing themselves and make it as hard as possible to make it any shorter by saying, this is vitally important, great interviews and everything else. One of the jobs I had to do, and the editor at the time, Michael Chapman, would say, get that under 3 minutes and 15 seconds so we don't have to pay them as much. So I would have to sit there and chop little bits out whilst it still made sense and get it down to a smaller amount so that we didn't have to pay them as much.
It's a scurrilous lie, but true. Yeah, absolutely, yes. 3:15 and 3:45 were the magic break points for freelancers, where you moved into the next rate. So their tapes would come in at 3:16, and the job of my two producers was to make sure those tapes were transmitted at 3:14 or 3:44, without sacrificing the report. Not all the time, but it was one thing that we were certainly enjoying to do. I mean, I hope we didn't take it to extremes. I don't think we took it to extremes, but quite clearly, when 2 seconds made a few guineas difference, that was quite important to do.
Do you think it would be better if we started with the actuality clean rather than doing a link from you and leave the link to John in the morning to do?
I don't think it needs rewriting if it just stress Mildenhall one.
That's what I thought, yes. For the last two Saturdays, there's been a medieval market in the middle of Mildenhall. We don't even need to say that Mildenhall is in Suffolk. If you can say the middle of Mildenhall, you're a better man than I am as well.
I think I can.
Centre of Mildenhall?
The alliteration. I like it.
If you can say it, keep it in. Get them all together now, right through to the end, apart from the end mute.
Michael Chapman there discussing the editing of a piece with another Roundabout East Anglia reporter, David Self, in a clip from the BBC Schools programme Communicate, which went behind the scenes on the show in 1979. As Phil Johnson recalls, reel-to-reel tape wasn't the only technology in use at the time, which would seem primitive to 21st century eyes.
Now, booking lines. Today, if you want to talk to somebody in Melbourne, you simply press a few buttons and it's there. And it's as good quality as I'm talking to you today, right now. If you wanted to in those days, you had to get hold of the post office, telephone people, and there'd be some, doddery old chap, with all due respect, and people have to plug things up and wind. I remember at Roundabout, sound effects were very limited. We wanted to have, say, an echo effect. Now, an echo effect today, you can do that just by touching one button. To get the sound of an echo, we had to book what was called the echo chamber in Birmingham, in BBC Birmingham. And we had to book like an hour's time of this line, which would cost a lot of money and everything else. And it would go through what was called the echo spring. And the Norwich radio studio was called M9, Midland 9. That was the name of it. And they used to have to book this thing, and we have to send the sound down that we wanted treated. They would treat it and send it back. It involved about 8 or 9 people. It's just amazing how those things have changed.
Maggie Secker again.
When I started there, it was teleprinters, typewriters, and the big old tape machines. And now, with the computers and the digital editing, it's such a wonderful, wonderful world. And we didn't even have fax machines. Everything was, you'll get it in the post tomorrow. Now, and with tapes, get it from the train. Now, if we wanted a story like that from Ipswich, we'd ring them up and they'd say, oh yes, which one is it? I'll pop it in an email. And you'd have it within minutes, wouldn't you? It's just that side of it, I think, is amazing and wonderful, the progress has been.
Well, Pat Beasley was on the 18th hole to see the finish of the tournament, and first he asked the Secretary of the English Golf Union, Ian Erskine, for his comments on the event. And Ian Erskine is going to comment. No, he's not. Oh dear, one of those technical problems that afflict us from time to time. Can we carry that report, folks, or can't we? We can. Yes, we can. No, we can't. Yes, no. Let's play some music, shall we? It's always safer. No, we can go to the report because we've got 2 minutes in which to do it. And here's Ian Erskine.
John Mountford struggling there with a tape which didn't quite make it. Ellis Hill also remembers the odd mishap.
There was an occasion where my alarm clock hadn't gone off, and I thought, oh my goodness, I've got about 5-10 minutes to get there. I chucked the dog in the car, chucked myself in the car, and went hell for leather down the road and got to the studio just in time to sit down and say, "Welcome to Roundabout East Anglia." I did the whole of that programme in my pyjamas because I hadn't got time to change or put clothes on. And I did have a live interview that morning, I remember, and I thought, God knows what he thinks.
We don't talk about late. The Roundabout East Anglia team don't talk about late. It's the most disorientating experience of your life when you're lying in bed listening to your radio and you think, oh, that's very interesting. That's an interesting story from Pat Beasley. I shouldn't be listening to this. I am the early morning shift producer. I used to do holiday cover for all the shifts. And I don't know why I had a run of just not waking up at all. I suppose because I hadn't done it for a while. You got into a routine when you were doing it, but when you did it only occasionally, it produces all sorts of interesting responses. I can only say that I think I probably achieved a world record time from my home in the suburbs of Norwich to St Catherine's Close at about 7 o'clock in the morning. So it was not a nice experience. I think we all had the problem of being late at some stage or other. Tribute to the engineers who just used to shrug their shoulders and get on with it, and when you walked in would say in that way that BBC engineers used to do. Afternoon, nice to see you. Everything's going well, don't worry. Go and get a cup of coffee. We've got it under control.
John Mountford here. A trifle breathless this morning, being as I just pounded up the stairs. I thought I wasn't going to make it for the first time in, 18 months. Anyway, I'll be telling you what's on in the programme a little bit later on. First, though, let's take a look at the morning's news headlines. The European Summit ended in Luxembourg last night, still without agreement on the aims of Britain's contribution to the community budget. Although concessions have been made on all sides, Mrs Thatcher continued to argue that we should make a net annual contribution of £150 million.
When I trained as an announcer in London, the one thing we were always told was, use the lifts. If you're going to go and read the news, you must not go upstairs. You can do it any other time, but not just before a bulletin. Because what happens is the rhythm of your breathing changes. If you get even slightly out of breath, and when you're trying to read something, you are breathing in odd places. And I should have known better, but I was late, and I let myself in with my key, and the shape of the building was you couldn't get straight from the back door at All Saints Green to the studio on the flat. You had to go downstairs, there were no lifts, and you had to go along a corridor, and then you had to go up more stairs to get back to the studio, even though it was on the ground floor like everything else. So it was forced upon me that I should run up those steps, and as I collapsed into place, I was able to go on air at the very start of the programme with only seconds in hand, and I realised then that I'd made the unpardonable sin. I'd run upstairs, and a few sentences in, sure enough, there was just no way I could breathe. I was so glad there were other people there that could take over.
The man who usually read the regional news bulletins from Norwich in the 1970s was Michael Drake, who'd spotted the opportunity going in a local newspaper.
I always like the sound of my own voice, you know. So I see this advert in the evening news. It was a sort of editorial type of thing, and it said the headline. You can see it now. So you think you could read the news? And I thought, big Ed, yeah, of course I can. So I applied for it, and it snowballed from there. The end result was, that's okay, you can start tomorrow. So I sat down the next morning with a bit of help, obviously, and just did it. And that was it.
Now it's 17 minutes to 9, so here's Michael Drake with the local news headlines.
29 people were injured at the weekend in a coach crash near Fakenham. 12 of the injured, including 2 children, were taken to hospital. At the time of the accident, they were on their way to the Spalding Flower Parade.
It was always at 5 to the hour. So within Roundabout it was 5 to 7 and 5 to 8. And then there'd be another one at 5 to 1, an opt-out from Radio 4. And the evening one was 5 to 6, I think. Just 5-minute bulletins and a little weather forecast. You had to listen to Radio 4, just wait for them. There would be a pause, obviously, and then you just flicked a switch, and you then got control of it. And at the other end, looking at the clock, countdown, with 10 seconds to go, just sort of hand over, and now back to Radio 4 in London or something like that, and turn the switch. Except for one famous day when I didn't do it, and I forgot to switch on. And of course, the papers love it, don't they? So the headline was, "There was not the news," or something like that.
Phil Johnson remembers some of the other regular contributors to the programme.
Well, 3 characters really stick in my mind. One is Tony Skase, who I have huge admiration for, who I work with at Roundabout and at Look East and at Anglia. Great guy, sadly no longer with us. Always keen and enthusiastic, always covering a story, self-taught and brilliant.
This is Radio 4 on VHF. Now, this is East Anglia Election Special, introduced by Tony Skase.
Good morning. In East Anglia, an election swing of just under 1.5% against the Conservatives in the first 8 seats announced. But the Tories hold on to 6 of the constituencies and Labour take 2. The biggest cliffhanger is at Peterborough, which is held by
Ron Fielder, who did all the farming programming, all the farming interviews. He would come in after harvest in a boiler suit, covered in bits of straw and dust and dirt, and his eyes, he'd been wearing goggles or glasses, and his eyes just appearing out of this mass, looking like something out of Central Casting from a comedy thing, complete and stinking of having been on a tractor all day harvesting. And he'd come in and he'd do it, and it was like 10 o'clock at night or 5 o'clock in the morning. He'd be there. He'd never let you down. He'd come in and talk about Rhynchosporium or Rajewski's disease or whatever it was that was making the farming news that day, and he'd be there.
Some of us have been waiting for. It's time for some gardening from Ron Fielder and the gardening team. Ron.
Hello again. Well, gardening this week comes from the Roundabout Garden at White House Farm at Sprowston, and it's for the last time. Unfortunately, our gardening team are somewhat incomplete in that our host, Simon McFarlane, he's in bed with flu, and Charles is away on holiday. But joining me is our old colleague, Ray Luce. Well, now, Ray,
and also dear old Ted Ellis, who fantastic, and used to come in and his nature talks, just unbelievable. What a fantastic knowledge. Those characters that really we have to thank regional broadcasting and local broadcasting for bringing to the airwaves.
John Mountford.
There were lots of people who came part-time. There was David Self, who covered religious affairs. David Self was setting questions for Sale of the Century for ITV as a freelance, and when we did some of our competitions, he brought some of the questions and just reversed them so we could use them in our competitions, which was quite amusing. Ted Ellis was a wonderful naturalist who I met frequently, and then even more so when we went on TV together and did many, many country walks together. And so actually saying all these names, the calibre of that small team was phenomenal.
It really is time for our naturalist Ted Ellis. This week he's been giving Michael Chapman something of the flavour of spring at his own broad just outside Norwich.
Well, we're down by the River Yare, in fact, and there's a vast sweep of reed beds here. You can just see the river in the distance with a line of tall willow trees, and the reeds are a sort of pale gold, still as they were in winter, except that at the bottom you can see a touch of green spear leaves coming up. And there's also a green tusk.
Harsh weather conditions would not have been good for recording nature features, but, as with all radio programmes, was something Roundabout occasionally had to deal with. In early 1979, the region faced one of its worst snowstorms for years, as John Mountford and Michael Chapman recall.
Well, the snow started to fall. We realised quite quickly that this was going to be a very heavy snow. I think we phoned the station and the railway station, and they said they were having problems getting trains in. And then we began to get phone calls from our own reporters from further afield telling us that it was really very, very heavy. And yes, it snowed us into the building. And what we decided to do was to stay on air, to put up our phone number in all sorts of places, and say to people, contact us, tell us what's going on. That then changed to where people were passing our number around. Even in Europe, we're getting calls from near Europe. Truck drivers from Holland wanted to come over and that sort of thing, and they'd got our number somehow. So we became a very busy switchboard. Everybody was at a different phone in the office. And we became a snow line, basically.
They say that the social services day centres will not be running today. Those particularly at Vauxhall, Gildencroft, Ipswich, Sproston adult training centres won't be open either. If you know of any old people in the Diss area who are in need of help, well, the Nunnery Old People's Home, Diss, have said they'll help.
Cancelled. Norwich Mozart Orchestral Rehearsal is cancelled. The Institute of Electronic and, I think that's Technical Engineers, Daytron, meeting at 7:30 tonight, that's cancelled. Central Area Junior String Orchestra at the Music Centre.
People have said it must be easier to say which schools are open. In fact, it's not, because it really does vary from area to area. For instance, the Nightingale First School at Taberham is closing.
That winter is memorable for me because I had to be brought in by Ron Fielder, the farming presenter, on one of his big four-wheel drive tractors, because there was absolutely no way that I could get out of my house up in Old Catton. And the weather was certainly bad, and also at that time there were severe problems with the telephone service because of the weather. And I have to admit that shamelessly I pulled rank with the with post office telephones because of all the work we did with them, and asked. They were cutting off residential telephones around Norwich to try and maintain essential services, and I did ring to say, look, we're trying to coordinate a service here for the radio. Can you please not unplug this bank of numbers on the Old Catton Exchange? So all my neighbours who maintained their telephone service for that for a few days in that winter when maybe their friends were saying, I've got no telephone, have got the BBC and me to thank for that, and common sense from post office telephones, because I was using my home as a kind of command centre to mastermind these things.
They bring out these books that go along with big memorable films like El Cid and things like that. They put that they use 28 tons of concrete and all that sort of thing. Give me some roundabout facts.
I knew you'd ask that, and I've scribbled some down. Between August 74 and this programme, this is the 1511th edition of Roundabout East Anglia. We're into our 3000th hour of broadcasting. We've covered 8,500 different stories, thereabouts, broadcast 1,309 hours on tape, which is 700 miles of tape. And if you're interested how far 700 miles is, that's from Ipswich to Thurso. And notice I haven't chosen Norwich to start the mileage from. And I reckon
I was very keen to make sure that it was not a Norwich-centric programme, and I think that comes from having listened to the Norwich East Anglian output in both Colchester and in my hometown of Chatteris in the Isle of Ely, where you would have thought that the world ended at the Norfolk border. I mean, there didn't seem to be a particularly good attempt to cover the region. Now, that's in part geography, impacting on technology, because it's the roads haven't improved that much in East Anglia, but it takes a long time to get material from one side of the region to the other, north to south, south to north, east to west, west to east.
Stuart Jarrold.
Well, I like to think by my regular contributions we did get a balance. Pat Beasley in Peterborough was coming up with stuff every day. Skase in West Norfolk was coming up with stuff. Carol West in Cambridge used to do stuff, and I did stuff in Suffolk and Essex. And I like to think that Mike Chapman, the producer, got the balance pretty well right, and I think the region was represented fairly on radio. There's a different argument for television. Sometimes it was felt to be Norwich-centric.
Phil Johnson.
I've had 30 years working for BBC East and for Anglia, and all the regional stations, the regional output is accused, and in many ways rightly so, of being Norwich-centric. But it's a matter of geography, it's a matter of logistics, it's a matter of response. You know, if you get a fire in Dereham, you can cover it quicker than if you get a fire in Milton Keynes and you've got nobody there. It's obviously going to happen. But there is a huge effort, and there was a huge effort then, to make sure you give as much coverage as you can to those other places and other people, because they're as vital, as anybody else.
Certainly as far as Ipswich Town were concerned, because I was covering them in Europe every year in the 70s. Every single year they did so well in the league that they qualified for Europe. The one year they didn't was 1978, and they finished about fourth bottom, but they won the FA Cup, beating Arsenal. Of course, I was lucky enough to be there. And after the cup final, the day after, the players obviously had a night of celebration in London, and they came back on a coach from London. And the bus stopped at Portman Road for players and officials to congregate before it went on the tour of the town, round to the town hall. Massive reception with thousands and thousands of people. And because I knew Bobby Robson, because I knew the police chief who was in charge of operations, I was the only journalist allowed on the bus. So it was a big Stuart Jarrold exclusive.
In the rooftops, in the trees, on balconies, everywhere there's a sea of blue and white. As far as the eye can see, every single person that I can see, and there must be tens of thousands, children, old age pensioners, young middle-aged women, mums with babies, everyone is decked out in blue and white. It is a truly unbelievable sight. Waving along with his players to the crowd on the bus is the Ipswich manager, Bobby Robson. Bobby, they say the Geordies know how to salute their footballers. What do you think of the Suffolk public?
You've got to see it to believe it. It is almost unbelievable. I never dreamed so many people would come out. And I would think there isn't one house in the town that is not represented here this afternoon.
They talk about the Pied Piper, but this is something
Dare I say it, that often Mike Chapman was quite pleased when he came up with a story, or one of his reporters came up with a story, and we broke it first on the news in the morning, and it made look easy to pick up and follow it up for that evening's television programme. That very often used to happen.
I suppose there was a sense of competition. I mean, we were certainly, I think, regarded in the building as an oddity. I mean, clearly the television programme was the flagship of what was being done. The news team, the news journalists, produced the opt-out bulletins on VHF as well. But I think we were an upstart. They weren't quite sure what we were about. And I suppose as a team, we took sort of quite considerable pleasure in upstaging the television operation, with getting stories first, despite the technical difficulties and geographical difficulties of doing that.
One issue the television team in Norwich didn't have to deal with was playing records. John Mountford again.
I was asked to look after the music. I mean, before that it had been a case of, we'll play a disc every so often when we've got nothing else to say, or we need to fill a gap, or there's a request from someone or whatever. It was a bit haphazard, and basically they said, right, John, you're looking after choosing the music. Now, with hindsight and knowing what an immensely complex craft it is, it was a mad thing to let me do, but they were glad to get it off their chests, because most of them, like Mike Chapman, were journalists, and they were sticking with the idea of the story is the important thing. That's what we're concentrating on, and the music's still sort of filling it in. But yes, it was left to me to choose the music, and I mean, there were times when I would say, let's have a track from ZZ Top. Or, I was picking the weirdest music to go in there. Nobody actually said at any time, no, we don't want any more of that. Well, I don't recall that.
And if that didn't reduce you to a blubbering heap, I don't know what will. Bright eyes from Art Garfunkel, and we're all sobbing into our champagne here. Right, I've just got time to mention just one or two more people who kindly wrote into us with cards and letters and messages of goodwill. Thank you for your superb programme. I have to get up to feed baby Kate in the middle of winter. Yes, 6:30 would seem like the middle of the night if it hadn't been for your programme. How nice. Peter and Valerie Woodrow, that is. I think it's Woodrow, or could be Woodbow of Wicklewood. Thank you very much. Chris and Pat...
It looked as though the inevitable would happen. I think one of the suggestions, as I recall, and this is a sort of a dim recall, that what might happen is that whichever the first station was to open, and I think it was always planned that it would be Radio Norfolk, simply because the hardware was close by. that the roundabout operation might remain to serve the Manningtree and the Malvern Hill Peterborough transmitters, so that we would continue to service Cambridgeshire and Suffolk before local radio came on. But you begin to see that that's really not an option. And I mean, for me, the final full understanding that the end was nigh was being invited out to a very memorable lunch by some very senior people from the BBC, whose names I'd only ever seen in the handbook and on memos, to be told that within a few months me and my team would be without a job, but don't say anything yet. And it's the way you hear business people say it. Is the most awful time when you're carrying this huge, not secret, I suppose, but you're carrying this burden of information that can't be passed on yet, knowing that you've got to keep working. You've got to continue to put the effort in. You've got to sound on air at that stage before the news is broken that nothing has changed, that everything's going okay, but knowing that it will all soon come to an end.
Maggie Secker.
I only worked there for a short time, and it was almost known when I went there. I think I was there 6-8 months working on it. And, I mean, yes, there was a very sad feeling there, and obviously nobody wanted their jobs to end. And local radio's name was mud. They didn't want local radio in Norfolk because nobody wants to lose their jobs, do they? That was the feeling just in the little net that I was in, So, and obviously when it did all happen, it was very, very sad indeed.
With BBC Radio Norfolk due to open in September, the final episode of Roundabout East Anglia was broadcast on Friday the 30th of May 1980.
So, sounds like a busy day on Radio 4. The time now is 6:30 and you're tuned to Radio 4 VHF for the Eastern Counties. Good morning, welcome. It's time for the very last Roundabout East Anglia.
The last day was just so sad. The press came in and took photographs. One of the things as well, Dr. Pete Rowan, he was the doctor who they did interviews and things with at various times. And he wrote out a death certificate for it. And he put on here, I've reported this case to the coroner because he listens to Terry Wogan and won't know otherwise. And the cause of death, withdrawal of electricity, memo from Aubrey, financial stricture, local radio, chronic Londonitis. These are the causes of death.
Was there an anti-Radio Norfolk feeling? No, I don't think so, because I think certainly people hope that that's maybe where their future might be. I'd done a short stint with Radio Leicester when I was told I needed to go and look at local radio, and had gone off to Radio Leicester in 1977 for 6 months. To see how local radio worked, and couldn't actually believe how local radio worked, given the staffing and the money that we were able to spend, and how you could do a 12-hour a day, 18-hour a day of service with the staff and the resources that they had. And of course, producers like John Mills had come from Radio Lancashire, Radio Blackburn. Local radio is certainly not a dirty word for me, because within a few months of Radio Norfolk opening, I was sent off to be acting programme organiser at Radio Oxford, and that led to my going up to Lancashire to become programme organiser at Radio Lancashire and manager at Radio Lancashire. So I don't think local radio was a dirty word. It's just at the time it represented a huge shock for us all to be shunted out of a way of working, to be shunted away from a programme that, although I suspect the audiences were small, the audiences seemed to be quite appreciative of what we were doing.
I noticed it when local radio came, when Radio Norfolk first started. Initially, there were lots of complaints. That was what I noticed. After it had gone, the kind of complaints that came rather than the accolades while it was there.
It was 18 months in my life, but it was a very happy 18 months. It made a huge change in my life, and I'm still here in Norfolk. So it was Roundabout that brought me here, and in fact that's why I've stayed here, because it was such a happy place to be.
Anyway, look, folks, we're all sitting here having a jolly good party, as it were. We're all, underneath it all, I think, very, very sad that it's coming to an end. Certain people can't be with us this morning, like Tony Skase, who we do miss because he's been a mainstay of the programme. I just can't find much else to say at the end of regional broadcasting for the Eastern region forever. So we might as well finish the programme with the words in music. It's the end of regional broadcasting, and goodbye from all the Roundabout team, starting with the editor, Michael Chapman, the producers, John Mills,
Carith Howell, Anne Jones,
and the reporters,
Pat Beasley,
Stuart Jarrold,
Carol West,
John Myatt,
Martin Pedrick,
and the features presenters,
Ron Fielder,
Michael Drake,
Ted Ellis,
Jean Goodman,
plus the station assistants,
Jan Harvey Gardner,
Jeremy Kime,
Anne Little,
and our team of secretaries,
Ross Young, Liz Howell, Julia Lacey, Margaret Secker.
Time for you to go.
You've been listening to Radio in a Roundabout Way, the story of Roundabout East Anglia. In the programme you heard from Tom Edwards, Michael Chapman, Ellis Hill, Phil Johnson, Maggie Secker, John Mountford, Stuart Jarrold and Michael Drake. Archive material was courtesy of the Norfolk Sound Archive, the Jean Goodman Estate, BBC Bristol, Michael Drake, Stuart Jarrold and Andy Walmsley. The programme was narrated and produced by Paul Hayes.
And that's it from me, John Mountford.
And from me, Ellis Hill.
And from everybody assembled in the studio. Bye-bye, thank you for listening.